All right, I finally have SFuels founder Leighton Phillips on the show. I think it's been about 4 years I've been trying to schedule this. So thanks for coming on the Low Carb Athlete podcast to talk about fueling and training for the endurance athlete.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, I think it was Kona in 2018 where we first connected. So
Yeah.
we've been busy people.
Yeah, you guys have done so much since I first met you guys in the train drink mix. And now you've got a full line of stuff and programs and amazing athletes involved in your program. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Journey.
we were a one product pony back then. So things have changed.
Yeah, I can't imagine doing all that. So let's dive in to talk about. I was like, ask people what's their why, your purpose, passion, what drives you. And there's always a story behind a product. So, especially the endurance athlete, because there's very few of us, especially back then, doing low carb, fueling low carb for the endurance sports, being a fat adapted athlete. And, we've been talking about this on the show for 10 years. I started doing all this testing metabolic efficiency back in 2005. So it's been a long time. And now finally people starting to figure it out maybe a little bit more that when you're doing Ironmans and marathons and trail running, it's not a carb fueled sport. So
Yeah.
talk about your story, your journey.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. There's just a ton of opportunity for innovation in this space. Frankly, I think we're all just scratching at the surface. But our story began, I guess, like a lot of the products in the industry, right? Where an athlete, generally has a problem with what's available and if it's not working for them for whatever reason. And begin to play around with alternatives. And we began to toy around on the back of gut problems that I was in Hong Kong at the time, huge ultra running scene down there. Yeah, I mean, 30 kilometers in, you're starting to get gut problems. And I was on a classic high carb off the shelf product. And so, yeah, we started toying around with things literally out of the kitchen. And then we started working with some labs in California on really developing. We felt like there's plenty of opportunity here to innovate, and the products that are available in the market, we didn't really like the approach they were taking. We thought that there was a better way to do this, and that was just an idea. And then we started working with the labs, and we did up some prototypes that worked well in a number of ultra races. And then, we felt like, initially it was really just the gut issue. And as a function of that, you kind of were limited to how much load you could put into your training. So as we began to create some of these products, and it was literally one initially a training product, we could really lay on a lot more volume. And initially the performance side, it wasn't driven off the back of performance, but what we found is as we were able to add a lot more volume into our training, performance certainly improved. And, since then we've taken it into the labs, and we can talk, Debbie, about the performances we've had obviously in the race field, but we have now a lot of lab data with all the work we've done with Dan Pleuse. And yeah, I mean, so that was our first product. And the SF in SFuels, a lot of people don't know this. They think it's like San Francisco or something like that, but
I never even thought about, yeah, what is SFuels?
Yeah, because everyone says SFuels or SF. How do you say this thing? Well, it's SFuels, but the SF was from the get-go. We wanted to, on one hand, look at, just, if you will, performance in the moment of whatever it is the sport you're doing, and then for the long range, the longevity of the lifestyle we love in this kind of endurance sport. So we did fasting blood glucose testing from the start on every product we develop. So the SF was with respect to spike free. And in fact, the first company we registered was registered as spike free. And then we got some better marketing advice, but that's what the SF stood for. And still to this day, every development we work on, we look at blood fasting glucose responses, classic testing. In fact, we just published a paper on our breakfast product up against rolled oats and a whole bunch of things. And yeah, it's really interesting data.
So you're testing the blood sugar so it doesn't spike more than 30, or what are you looking for when you're testing products? spike free? What's
Typically we're more in the single digit space. We you know, even our breakfast product, it might come up 10 points. And even that, you know, there's a lot of stuntsmanship out on social media with doing this fasting blood glucose testing, but we really look at not really just the spike, but what you're really looking for if there's an actually inverted decline, which is a classic signal of insulinogenic response. And we're also just understanding postprandial after the intake of that food, what happens with the next meal. There are two factors that are really important, particularly when you're trying to optimize fat oxidation. You really want to obviously limit insulinogenic response. So that's what we're looking at when we do this testing.
So when you started this product, it was more a personal interest because you're trying to figure out, you're curious of how not to have GI stress as a endurance athlete. You do triathlons and ultra running yourself, right? And so common like GI stress is what a lot of people come from, having too many sugars and bars and glucose, whatever products in their belly, throwing up while they're racing, having diarrhea and all the great things as endurance athletes. But you started to think outside of the box back when you were racing.
Yeah, that was the driver. I mean, my background has a technology bent, and then I studied 6 years in naturopathic medicine. I practiced for a few years. And my wife's ex-Nestle, she runs the business. So together we kind of had the science and like the business side of the food business, if you will. So I felt like with my naturopathic studies, which has a lot of focus on gut health, that there was just something wrong here. Initially, I thought it was just me. And when I started looking at sports science research, particularly in Ironman, UTMB, and some of the large 100 miles around the world, I find that there's a ton of research on, you know, gut distress association with both high carb use and also some of the caffeine formulas. So that's where it began. But since then, of course, we've done a lot of work on how we formulated the product to optimize performance. So, yeah.
So let's start with how to be fat adapted. I know Dr. Dan Pleuse, I've been doing his Endure program, stuff that we've talked about, you know, metabolic efficiency testing, as I said, starting that back in 2005 and becoming fat adapted athlete. What have you found is good? Because before you want to take your products, which we'll get to, how to fuel the low carb athlete, but how do we become a low carb athlete that burns fat as their main fuel source? I mean, we've talked about this 1,000 times, but what is your perspective on that fat adaptation process from?
Yeah, I think there's three elements here. One is obviously training protocol. Secondly, you know, you can make gains by just raw volume of training, and particularly zone 2 aerobic training. But ideally, to really kind of thrust you into a far more efficient fat oxidation metabolic state, we do think there needs to be a, you know, if you will, cold keto transition phase to really help catapult you into that. And then once you're there, there is more flexibility and give once you're there relative to volume and training load. So, you know, we can talk about each of them, but I think firstly, from a training perspective, you know, honestly, best bang for buck is still in terms of hours per week. If you're going to be doing, you know, only 11 hours a week, well, your first 10 should be in zone 2, you know, aerobic work. And that's purely a function of really improving mitochondrial density and even enzymatic improvements in how fat is oxidized. We've had athletes that in the labs have tripled those numbers. And a lot of that's to do with just getting that ratio right between zone 2. And there's not a lot of value in doing high intensity if you're only doing a few hours of zone 2 every week. So that's the first thing. And then typically we talk about a 2-week cold keto phase to really help thrust, you know, an athlete into that state. And even like coming into each season, you're coming off the off season into the on season, if you will. A lot of athletes now who have a lifestyle like this will run that or rerun that, you know, 2 weeks of kind of a lower carb state. But once you're through that, Debbie, like again, when, you know, athletes in kind of half Ironman, full Ironman, 50K to 100 mile, running, I mean, generally they're probably sitting in the 100 to 150 state, which is not, it's not keto low. It's low relative to the Western diet. But, you know, we certainly in our lab data would suggest that they can still have, you know, one point something grams per minute of fat oxidation when they're out on the metabolic cart. And that's a good signal that, you know, they're processing fat pretty well.
So is that looking at the RQ value when you're doing the metabolic testing to see
Yeah, we
where they're at?
typically run a 20-minute you know, basically intensity ramp, and then it's essentially a VO2 max, and then calculated, you know, they're calculating through their carbon dioxide and oxygen you know, consumption. And we basically are looking for, as we get into that threshold space, like what is their fat max, and we feel like from a you know, Dan's shop and our shop, somewhere between 1 and 1.2 is a fairly you know, healthy range for the sport that we're talking about. And I would just emphasize, like, we can get on and talk about our racing products,
Yeah.
you know, but the segmentation at SFuels, it's not all about fat oxidation. The body, not by fluke, has a very strong ability to oxidize carbohydrate, has a very strong ability to oxidize fat. And it's not about one or the other.
Yeah.
But really thinking about the structure of the event that we're going after and optimizing accordingly. So, you know, all I'm talking about so far is the baseline of, you know, training fat oxidation.
And that's why I felt like this was an important conversation to have, because I've been talking so much about this. And I think it's so confusing out there in social media, hearing all this keto information, but it's not for the endurance athlete or the female athlete. We need to adjust those recommendations. And the main goal is to be burning fat as our main fuel source, but still be able to shift to that carb rocket fuel backup source when required. And we'll get into fueling, because I think that's an important part of why I love what you guys offer, your education in the product, that you need to have some carbs. And I think so many people that get into keto for keto endurance and keto athletes that think I need to be in nutritional ketosis when I'm doing these long training events as a 3-4 hour long bike ride or trail run, that they need to show ketosis. And they're all about, like, what can I do to stay in ketosis when they join our Facebook group page? And I'm always like, isn't it the main goal to burn fat as your fuel and have that ability to shift to carbs when I'm going to race? Because sometimes you might have a steep hill climb, or you're going to have a surge, or you're in a race and you're actually going to pick up the pace. So I think there's so much more confusion out there for people that are athletes switching to trying to be keto, but when is it appropriate to show nutritional ketosis? And that's what I like Dan's Endure IQ program for people to do, and then using your fueling and training program. So
yeah, we've split it up. Like, I mean, you know, I guess on one hand, you could look at SFuels. We have a true segmentation between endurance athletes and like active lifestylers that are non-competitive in a sense. And on that side of the house, actually, you know, there's not a lot of need for, you could absolutely go keto. You don't need a whole lot of carbohydrate in that state. But for the endurance athlete, if performance is what you're after, why wouldn't you oxidize both? Right. The problem is, of course, is that most metabolism left to their own devices will gravitate to, you know, more carbohydrate centric diet and lifestyle, particularly in the world we're living in. So, so yeah, I mean, we're not against keto. In fact, we really have built a segment strategy that talks to that active lifestyle that needs convenience, and there is a lot of health benefits in a keto profile, but don't expect when you roll up for a 70.3 that when the gun goes off, you may have all the horsepower that, you know, someone who's doing fat and carb beside you has.
Yeah. And that's why I like what Dan has to say in the Endure program is, you know, looking at training low, racing high, and we'll get to that gradually, working towards the how to fuel, because that's the confusing part for people. But training, we talked about, just summarize, we're saying, like, you know, we talk 80% of the time we're doing the maffetone type of low intensity zone 2. And if you can, ideally get metabolic testing cart from somewhere near you, so you can figure out what exactly those numbers are, and they will change each season too. They're not going to be like last time I got tested, I was able to go up to 160 something and burn tons of fat, but not anymore at this age. At my level, I'm not training for Ironman, but at my highest point of as athlete, I was able to go very high percentage of fat at a high heart rate because of the way I trained and fueled. But looking at that is so important to add in appropriate time when to add in that HIIT science. Like we just talked to Paul Larson and talk about that 20% when it's appropriate after you built your foundation of zone 2, when to add in the HIIT training. And side note, I just was recording a little video this morning for my Instagram that, okay, because I think a lot of people think they do HIIT training, but they really don't push themselves hard, that they're just still kind of like, oh, I'm doing intervals, but they're not going all out to make it really effective.
Sitting over zone 3. Yeah. No, that's fairly common. There's a really good, by the way, I think I've watched it 4 times, and it's a 2-hour long detailed science podcast by Peter Attia and Inigo Samalan. And Inigo is he's out at the University of Colorado, but he's the performance physiologist for Tadej Pogačar, the cyclist, the Tour de France cyclist. And that 2 hours is all on the detailed science of what you just talked about. Zone 2, how much time to spend on it, what happens in the physiology. So if you really want to go deep into science, that's a great detailed review of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important part, because as I keep sharing my journey as I turn 50, I'm not going to train the same way that I did when I was 30. And I can tell intuitively, I just lack that get up and go power and speed. So I need to do, plus I've been doing stuff for 25 years, low heart rate, long distance stuff. So my body's pretty good at going long and slow. I need to get faster. So as a female aging athlete, I'm going to add in a little bit more training, and looking at what Dr. Stacy Sims is showing her science, that, she calls it SIT, short intensity intervals, like 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but go hard as you can. And I, again, say so many people, we don't know how to go hard because I think when we do low heart rates too long and we forget to add that HIIT training in, we lose that ability to like know how to push yourselves, because we're like, oh, in that comfort, I can stay here forever, that we don't know what that go all out feels like.
It's funny you say that, because I hadn't had metabolic testing done until a few years back, and it really came into Dan suggesting doing it. And then I went and got the data, and I sent the data to Dan. And similar to yourself, like, I can burn fat and go all day. But then he was saying you're lacking the top end. So, and we get a little bit of input back on, do you lose your top end with this? One of our athletes who actually just won in Utah in July, he became the world champion age group Ironman athlete. He set the record there in Utah. Matt Kerr. When Matt started working with SFuels and Dan back in, I think it's 2019 or 18, he had a fat oxidation level of 0.53 milligrams per minute, but that was at 135 watts. So his maximum fat oxidation was happening at 135 watts. Today, he's got 1.8 grams of fat per minute, and he does that at 300 watts. So we know it's highly trainable, and it's not about losing that top end, but it is absolutely about exactly what you said. You've got to have that foundation, and then you've got to add your high intensity interval work above that.
Yeah, because I have a lot of new clients recently that are trying to get this fat adaptation process through matching their nutrition and training in their labs and the holistic approach I do. But I've been doing that black hole training, that what we always talk about, the low and slow, and then there's high, but that in between black hole, we want to avoid. So many people, when they start like a math type of low intensity training, like, I can't run below 150 heart rate. It just doesn't go down, or just keeps crawling up. So I think it's important to have that foundation and then layer in
the other one too, that's interesting. And the more data we get, the more we see a difference between, you assume that, when you stand on a treadmill and run this test, and then you move to a bike, that those numbers will be the same. We've seen dramatically different numbers between bike and run in terms of how the body handles carbs and fat. And that's really important in the spirit of, if you knew that, what you would do in the nature of a triathlon race would be quite different to what you would take on the bike and what you would take in the run. So it's really important.
So let's get into fueling. Because going back to you said what Dr. or Dan Pleuse talks about is, that in the endure program, 100 carbs, 130 carbs. And I think it varies, especially for females. I'm trying to map it out for that's going to be different around ovulation, their luteal phase. It might be a little higher. And then also tapering for a race, adding in, because we get confused of what we hear out there from mainstream keto is 50 grams of carbs total a day. And athletes are scared to do 100 or 300 grams, and they still show fat burning or so low levels of ketosis. Maybe it's like 0.5 on their keto blood meter. But what fueling and how do we use like nutrition, real food, and then looking at your training products when we're eating food or eating meals during the day, and then when we're training, how do we fit in our macros? Like, how do we adjust things to be still burning fat? And we're working on, say, a 3-4 hour bike ride, and I want to eat my dinner Friday night for a long ride, is what I keep talking about, what to eat that morning of. People get confused, like where to time their carbs so they're not going to have a glucose spike.
So the first thing, we spent a lot of time talking to people about what happens between, if you will, on the couch and then just actively, meaning like walking or what have you, and then as you go into aerobic and then into anaerobic, understanding how those different systems switch on and off in those periods can guide us a lot to think about then how we would fuel. At rest, the channels in the muscle cell that can take glucose are really only opened up through insulin. And that is a function of, obviously, sensation of rise in blood sugar levels and a pancreatic response to that. It takes about 30 to 60 minutes of muscle contraction, and there's still a debate out there whether it is the contraction itself or whether it's calcium ions and nitric oxide, some of the free radicals that come about as a function of muscle contraction that triggers, if you will, some of the internals of the cell to actually shift things to the cell edge to open up those channels without insulin. But it takes about 30 to 60 minutes, and why there's a range there is all to do with intensity. But at that point, it's not that you need insulin to get glucose out of the blood supply and into the cell. And it's at that point that you have the ability, because there's very little insulin, to then simultaneously be oxidizing fat and carbohydrate. So what does all that mean? Well, what that means is that if you are in a state where you're not active and you are to take carbohydrate at that point in any form, and obviously, the glucose index and also load can have a lot of effect on the nature of the insulin response. But at that point, if you were to take carbohydrate, you will see a rise in insulin, and that clearly will blunt a ketogenic state. It will blunt the oxidation of fatty acids and lipolysis. As you begin to increase your intensity of training or high intensity training, what have you, or racing, and those GLUT4 channels open in the muscle cells, at that point, you have a lot more flexibility. I would only add that the quality of carbohydrate at that point can have a lot of bearing on how the body handles it, both in the gut and the liver, and obviously the transport towards the muscle cells. So
just hold on. You said a key word that I keep saying: quality carbohydrate. I think that's the biggest confusion.
Sorry, you broke up there.
Quality carbohydrate, right?
Sorry, you broke up there for a second. You might want to just restate that, Debbie. Sorry.
So quality carbohydrate is what a lot of people, I think, get misled of. I'm going to add more carbs in. We're all saying real food, nutrient dense, quality, nature's food, carbohydrates. And I think that's where I always feel like lately I need to be more specific. Yeah. This is what we're all talking about. We're not saying go get this packaged food. We're saying go get your safe starches, whatever you want to call it, your underground vegetables, fruits, your berries, stuff like that. But so I just wanted to throw that in. Quality.
Yeah, I mean, generally it was the same as you. I mean, your classic berries, right? Non-starchy veg, And even if you go into some of the starchy veg, you know, we've written a few articles on this, is, you know, there is a way to offset that in terms of how glycemically responsive those foods are by basically heating them up and then cooling them and getting the resistant starch level to rise in those whole foods, right? So you see in the Asian foods a lot of, you know, cooled rice consumption. You'll see cooled potato consumption. The Western diet less so, but there's a reason for that, and that is that resistant starch rises, the blood sugar response is much less on those types of starches.
Yeah. So sorry to interrupt there, but I just think that's so important to
Yeah.
clarify what the word
No.
carbohydrates gets tied into
Sure.
everything. So go on.
So then if you kind of put that out against a day, like, then, you know, I mean, typically we're kind of more advocating if it's a morning training session, is to do that somewhat fasted, meaning, if you will, start the day without food. Obviously hydration is fine. Have the session, and we can talk about the nature of that session. You might tweak things a little bit depending on the nature of that session. Come out of that, and then you've got a window where still those GLUT4 channels are open to take in glucose. You've not got glucose hanging around in the bloodstream for so long. So it gives you a little bit of a window there that if you're going to have some of the starches we just talked about, that would be a good window to take it. And frankly, after any of your training blocks, that is a good window to take it.
So just maybe tie in that what you're just saying is working out fasted in the mornings. That was a big discussion this year. It's like, do I eat or do I not eat? And if I'm going to go work out, it's like we were in Austin working out in the gym 6 a.m. I'm not going to eat something. I'll have coffee, a few sips, and a little bit of cream. Or I've been using Laird's creamer with some mushroom adaptogens in it because I'm into that. But when is it, you know, I think it gets confusing. I know Ben Greenfield says 12 to 15 hours, but if I ate dinner the night before, 12 hours before, I can do a fasted workout. But I think this is where we get abusive, as especially stressed people and female athletes, of doing too long of a fast and going into the exercise and depending on the intensity. So anything add in there would be great.
Our thoughts there are, if you look at the half-life of insulin, it's actually fairly rapidly passed through the liver and degraded. And I think, look, again, it's funny, if I was talking to an Asian audience, I'd really have a topic on this, because it's common for parts of Asia to be consuming their dinner meal at 9, 10, 11 p.m. at night. In the Western world, that's more so in the 6, 7 p.m. at night. So I think that, you know, from our perspective, it feels like, you know, 8 to 10 hours, I think is a good period of time to just let, you know, things pass through the stomach. We think insulin absolutely is cleared by then. And coming into that first training session, sure, caffeine-based products, in fact, probably are helpful in the spirit of what they can do with accelerating fat oxidation. But outside of that, I would, you know, not do anything and just let the body, you know, force the body, if you will, into a sense, starting to utilize fat out of the blocks for the day.
Yeah, because I've had these conversations, because I've been doing fasted exercise for years, and in the morning, because it's just, you know, I'm not going to get up and eat. I'm not hungry. And 2, I don't want to eat or exercise with food in my belly. So
I think it's more
easier.
a cognitive function we need in the morning. And I think it's more cognitive support is, and, you know, whether it's coming into training or coming into the day in the office, I think cognitive support is what we first probably need. It's really from if particularly once fat adapted, it's not like you really need this straight out of the blocks in the morning.
Yeah. Plus cortisol is up in the morning too at its highest point. So you're going to have some natural energy. That's why glucose will be a little naturally higher. So I think that's important to look at. But I think you know, I'm always saying too, is what you're doing working for you? If you're trying to lose weight and you're exercising, doing fasted exercise, or you're, you know, going too low carb, maybe there's something you need to course correct, adjust for you, the individual, when you're working on this fat oxidation program, if you're not losing weight. And because I think a lot of people do all this stuff, like, okay, I still have 20 pounds to lose. What's missing?
Well,
But it's stress.
the other piece that I just wrote another paper, in fact, last week on this, and that is, protein shakes is it's a very strong US cultured thing. Like I feel like I've lived in 5 countries now around the world. I feel like it's very strong here that wake up and grab and go heavy protein shake. And I'm not really pushing so much on the risk of gluconeogenesis, where you take in protein and it converts it to glucose. I'm not a big believer on that being a major problem here, but I absolutely, for whey proteins, you start getting up into the 30 gram per dose space, and that whey protein isolate particularly can be quite insulinogenic. So, your blood sugars, it may be pick your product on the market, but it might have some type of sugar alcohols, which we can talk about. We don't use it, but the sugar alcohols and protein and a flavor. So it's sweet. There's very little carbohydrate, but has this high isolate. So it's not like your blood sugars are going to go up, but what you will see go up is an insulin response from that isolate. And I think some people are kind of thinking they're doing everything and they're having the shake every morning only to work out. They just can't get rid of this last part of this weight around the middle. And
Yes.
I think it's a lot to do with the insulinogenic response of shakes every morning.
Okay. So if we wake up and we exercise, because a lot of us are triathletes doing 2-a-days.
Yeah.
So example, I usually run a couple days during the week, maybe some intervals, high, low, or maybe low, easy, depending on the workout. But then I swim masters usually at noonish time. So, and that often can be hard or it can be easy depending what I feel like doing, staying in the back or pushing myself. So how would you fuel with real food and looking at what SFuels provides the endurance athlete? Because I think that gets tricky, what to eat and when and where. Yeah, I want to be burning fat when I'm working out, but sometimes I need that carb backup fuel because I'm going to do hard speed workout. I'm going to be doing sprints in the pool in masters. So what have you guys found as the low carb athlete fueling them for improved performance in their training?
When we started, the first product we built was a bar product, but the first hydration product we built was our train product. And if you look at that, there's only 60 calories per serve. So by design, you look at that and you say, well, what's this doing? By design, it's not trying to mimic the calories out, calories in construct. It is literally trying to use certain fats that stimulate the body from an enzymes perspective to use fat. So that's where we started, and it was working well. However, we quickly got into exactly what you said, which was for athletes doing back-to-back sessions in a given day, the bounce back, if you will, for the second session, we felt like, particularly if the first session was some type of long, slow distance session, aerobic zone 2 session, and then the second session was a more, intense, interval-based type session where the intensity was higher. What we built in our Race Plus products for high intensity training and racing is that there should be, on that first session, after an hour into it, some carbohydrate that really is replenishing to set you up for your second session after. It's not like for that first session you really need it, but you will absolutely notice a difference by adding some there and having it, support your second session. And what I said earlier is really important here. This is not about, on that first session of the morning, out of the blocks starting on a carbohydrate product. You need that 30 to 60 minutes initially, let the GLUT4 channels open up, then you can add your fat and your carbohydrate together, and you will not be you can see this on a blood glucose. Most people that do their blood glucose testing do it on the couch in the morning and waking up, right? If you really want to see some interesting stuff, is do it through your training blocks. And you'll see that if you start taking some carbohydrate an hour in, very little change, right, in ketogenic response, little change in blood glucose response, insulin response. You don't actually produce a lot of insulin during training. So this is important because now you can simultaneously take both substrates in it's not really affecting the here and now of fat oxidation, but it's going to help that second session in the afternoon.
So that's like 2 hours after your morning workout. So maybe you're done at 7 a.m. So maybe you wait 2 hours. So 9 a.m. you start to have some fat carbs, or how long?
I was more kind of in the
hour.
actual training session.
Oh,
so let's say it's an hour and a half long training session. First half hour, whether you use our train product, which has 0 carbs, or it's sub 1 gram of carbs, or whatever you use. And then the next hour, if again you're having a second big interval session in the afternoon, the second hour of that first training, you can add some carbohydrate.
So it's funny, is just from doing this for so many years that you kind of get to a point, I think a lot of people experience, is that they feel guilty having any carbohydrates. So then you have to like, oh my gosh, I'm cheating if I have carbohydrates. And that's what I always ask people when they say, you know, what do you eat for fuel? And all just the questions you get in this Facebook group page we have, Keto Endurance, that it's like, do you want to improve performance? Do you want to get faster, or are you just trying to finish? And so I think it goes to, what are your goals? You know, are you trying to burn fat, or, you know, you look at the stress and the sleep component. Are you totally stressed out and then you're not eating anything and I'm going to go do another workout? Because I can not eat for 4-hour back rate. I can work out in the morning and not eat until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But is that good for me? Is that causing more stress and damage to my body, or is it going to help my performance or fat loss? So I'm always asking those questions to myself and others.
Yeah, I think, you know, for some folks, rightly or wrongly, the competition is the biggest number on their ketone or glucometer, right? And if that's your goal, you know, probably, your routine is going to be different. But, you know, if we're after performance, the body is not just by luckily has these 2 ways to oxidize different substrates. It's there for a reason. And using both for the right reasons is we think what's best for performance. And
I think Rob Wolf has really been speaking out about that too, because he comes from the jiu-jitsu and CrossFit background, that more of a higher heart rate workout. And it's probably Dr. Stacy Sims' argument against carb battle we all have, is that, you know, they're doing higher intensity workouts, but what if you are fat adapted doing the low heart rate? But, you know, it's not, you need to have both. And when you need that, you know, I think it's important, because I know some people that just are on the 0 carb mentality, and that we have demonized carbs. Totally. But again, quality source carbs.
And we got a real range now. Like, you know, like again, when we started, we started with working with Dan, and then the last 18 months, for example, we've had this kind of range between, say, a Hayden Wild, who's now the #1 WTC triathlete in the world, and it's Olympic distance, right? And what he's doing is a live low, but a lot of his training is high intensity, because that's the nature of his race. So his substrate mix is different. That if I compare the kind of 100-mile world record holder and Zach Bitter, you know, Zach really he does a lot of just miles in that zone 2 aerobic space. But like when he set 11 hours 9 for a 100-mile world record on the treadmill, he only went through 13. He only went through 13 serves of our Race Plus drink. And if you do the math on that, it's just very little carbohydrate. So it shows you what's possible. And that's, you know, he's running their sub 3-hour marathons, 4 of them back to back, you know, so
it's crazy. Yeah. We'll talk to him tomorrow, actually. But what I think is important is that what you're saying is personalized. There is not one size fits all approach. That's why, you know, I'm doing this as a coach. I call it the holistic method, that I work on the nutrition and exercise, but also your stress impacts everything. And your sleep. If I have a client now who does not sleep at all, and she'll be up all night, and so that's going to impact your effort to eat right. Good choices, have energy to exercise, to make good decisions, your gut health, digestion, you know, and gratitude, play, and laughter is one of my elements. Because I think so many people, we get so type A driven, high charging individuals, that we're so wound up, uptight, that we don't know how to chill and relax. And I learned that from personal experience. You need to like let loose and have fun, be silly and act like a kid and play, but also have gratitude every day. So I think there's so much more to it.
Yeah, well said.
So I want to get into your products. So if I'm training low, as we talked with Dan Pleuse about train low, race high, how do we do that? And how does SFuels help us? Because it's hard to find fueling for the low carb athlete, endurance training, and like adjusting those macros based on our intensity, and then get to what we do race day.
Yeah. We felt like, as I said
Open up.
earlier, we weren't really bought into kind of some of these, this, sorry, you're still there?
Yeah, I just pulled up your sharing the screen.
Oh,
So I just want to
okay.
share what you're
Yeah,
talking
if you
about
go
as you're
to
going.
if you go to the shop there and then go to performance athletes, you'll see that there's a product down there called SFuels Train. And we felt like, firstly, the output, just the nature of training, it needs to be very close to water. It can't be this like, thick, consistent. It needs to be, yeah, that's it there. It needs to be much closer to a water-like consistency. And what you'll find, Debbie, in there's the carbohydrate side of the house in terms of sports nutrition industry, and then there's this low carb side of the house. Well, we don't use any carbohydrate. It's like sub 1 gram, and it might be, depending on one flavor, it might be 2 grams. But the calories that it is in here comes from medium chain triglyceride. And you got to be careful here. And this is where some of my background and Nicole's background came into it. You'll find that it's easy and cheap to, when you do freeze drying of a medium chain triglyceride, is to attach it to a maltodextrin. And it's just orthogonal to what you're trying to achieve here, right? So we didn't go down that path. It's absolutely cheap way to do it. If you're trying to hit a price, go right there. But we fused it with a collagen, and for that reason, collagen is a very low insulinogenic form of protein. In fact, some would say you improve insulin sensitivity. So we fused the medium chain triglyceride with that, and then we added some electrolytes. And you'll find with almost every one of our products, I think all except the bar product, we have a glutamine addition to that. And all of that, we can talk a lot about that, but it's all to do with heat-triggered distress on the gut membrane through exercise, and what we're trying to do to support that.
I love that, because I've talked about that for a long time and learned that, I think when your product came out, it's like glutamine. And then I got into more health coaching and lab testing, and glutamine is so huge for gut health. And then how many athletes, when we're training in hot weather, get leaky gut when you're in hot weather? And if you're doing long training sessions, you are going to get leaky gut.
Right.
Like guarantee you have a leaky gut. So glutamine is one of the ingredients that I actually always put in a recovery shake for myself, and then tell my clients, do glutamine and colostrum. But to have that in your training drink is pretty interesting.
Yeah. And then, just on another page here, we have our our recovery product, and we do a really quite clinical high dose of glutamine on that. And we can talk more about that later if you like.
Yeah. So
yeah, that's where we start. But again, as you'll see with this, it's like, 60 calories. And the whole intention there is to really drive all the enzymes associated with fat oxidation, is really to set the body up for that metabolism. So that we're not really trying to just, you go out for a training session, you burn 300 calories, so we're going to give you 300 calories. That's not at all what we're trying to do with that product.
Yeah. So that's if you use that for just a regular training ride when you're doing low heart rate. So people can click on that. So 4 flavors, everyday cold drink, nutritional ketosis during the day, drinking that, or long, low heart rate intensity. Now, what if you are doing a workout that is going to be more high intensity interval training, or maybe you're doing like the bike ride I did Saturday is uphill for an hour. So there's no low heart rate.
That's a great contrast. Classically for a lot of us athletes who have day jobs, right?
Yeah.
What happens during the week and what happens on a weekend is very different. So during the week, you might have only an hour, hour and a half for a session. And what I said earlier was, if you go to our Race Plus product there, you should scroll down there. Actually, if you just go to shop and then go to performance app, oh, there it is. If you go to on the left there, Race Plus drink.
Back there.
I'll find it here for you. Just scroll down here a bit. and you'll see
The
there
race.
middle. You got it in the middle. Yeah. Race plus drink in the middle. Yeah. So what I said earlier was, regardless of, whether it's a hour and a half or it's a 4-hour session, that first 30 minutes to an hour, and again, it comes down to your intensity, and you can actually get tests done to really understand this, but generally that first 30 minutes to an hour, you should be staying with water or the SFuels Train product, because still at that time, your GLUT4 channels haven't opened up, and therefore you are at risk to actually have an insulin response to any form of carbohydrate, whether it's this product or anything else. So regardless, before we get into the Race Plus product itself, that first 30 minutes to an hour is really just, whether it's water or our Train product. So, you're not having any risk to stimulate insulin. As you get over through that first hour in the Race Plus product, it's a mix of, we use a branched cyclic dextrin or a highly branched cyclic dextrin. And all that means is you take a starch and you apply an enzyme to it to branch it, to break it up. And the value of that is, our point of view is, when you need a carbohydrate, when you really need it, i.e. high intensity, not when you're sitting on the couch, but when you're in high intensity, you don't need it in an hour. You need it now, right? So the reason we chose that, it has an osmolality characteristic that allows it to be very light, and it comes through the gut fast. It comes through the stomach very fast. In fact, some of the research on this is like 30% faster than straight glucose. So this is not the product that when you're sitting watching TV to be, swigging back. This is purpose built for high intensity to get carbohydrate into the system when the GLUT4 channels are open. It's going to come in. It's not needing insulin. It's going to come in and get absorbed in the muscle cell. We still have the medium chain triglycerides in there. The only other thing we add is a form of magnesium diglycinate, which is extremely low gut irritation, as opposed to a lot of your, other forms of magnesium. So that's what we would use in those then high intensity training. And the same applies to racing on race day. Race day, breakfast, very, low insulinogenic foods. That first, in triathlon, it's easy to swim. You're not taking much anyway. So you have your swim, come out of the water. And really at that point, you're ready to start taking on carbohydrate. The GLUT4 channels are open and you can start using it.
Yeah, that's what Dan Pleuse has in the Endure program, how he uses SFuels, but, he eating more of a protein and fat, easy to digest before the race. If you're going to go swim, and then you don't, because if you eat more carbs before then, you'll shift to carb as your main fuel source in the beginning.
Yeah, we did an actual study Dan ran in his labs with some of his students, where we showed that between carbohydrate, protein, and fat, you could have some types of protein that would have very little blunting effect on your fat oxidation, whereas obviously carbohydrate would blunten that fat oxidation, fat, very little response. So, that morning meal on race day, and we've done a lot of shows on our own podcast about this, really needs to be of foods that are, race day morning is not about the morning to be bulking up on calories. That should have been done the several days prior. But it needs to be of a point where you have satisfaction, you've got sense of fullness, and frankly, your cognitive function is turned on. That's really should be the focus of race morning. And you can do that with, a bit of fat, a bit of protein, and whether it's coffee, tea, or we have a primed product we can talk about also.
Yeah, and I know I'm going to run out of time because I talked too long in the beginning, but the cognition part, does that have enough MCT oil? Like people talk about taking ketones during a bike ride to have more focused cognition for racing.
If you go down just one more down, and you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a product called Primed. It's not ketone based at all. We do have a ketone product. We can talk about it, but the Primed product is an extract from green tea extract. And there's two functions here we use this product for. One is for, cognitive improvement, and the other is for further up regulating fat oxidation efficiency. And that is a a dose-dependent response. And what I mean by that is you actually don't need a lot of caffeine for an improvement in dopamine sensitivity. And you only need about 0.5 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which translates to, in simple terms, a cup of coffee, tea, and you're in that space. So that's why cognitive wise, coffee, tea works. The problem, of course, with coffee and tea is you don't know really how much you're going to get on the day because of the bean and the way you blended it. There's just a 2x difference. What we've done here is a measured dose of caffeine. But then if you want to turn this into an upregulation of fat oxidation, the way that you do that is you need to be in the 2.5 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. And it's at that point that you can get anywhere up to a 25% increase, like upregulation in fat oxidation. And we give guidance in our guides in terms of how would you do that? Well, you would take a half a gram, like one sachet, if you will. If you were a 70 kilogram person, you would take one sachet before the race starts, and then in your hydration up in the front of your handlebar, on your race bars, you would have another 2 serves, and you'd take that in over the first hour of the bike, if you will. So you've then got about 6 hours before caffeine has basically, like, the half-life of caffeine is about 6 hours. So depending upon the event, half Ironman, you're probably done. Full Ironman, you could start another cycle of that. 100 miler, you've certainly got time for another cycle of that to, keep your fat oxidation upregulated.
Now, if people are watching the video version, I have your brochure, which is amazing chart you guys have available on your website. So if you just go to, where is it? It was guide.
Yeah,
right?
go to learn and then guides.
And then guide. Yeah. And then you can pull up this excellent handout to really walk you through how to, train, fuel train, and be formed. So I'm just like clicking on here. We talked a little bit about the 1 to 3 hour workout, low intensity. And then if you're doing higher intensity or racing, 3 hour plus, have the SFuels race. And then post workout, I think it's important I always wait until I feel hungry and not eat right away, because I'm more sympathetic right away. So, I don't know if you have guidelines how long to wait until you have a post-workout drink like this. So this is called Revival. Talk a little bit about this before we run out of time.
Yeah, look, it is quite personal, that piece. But from a pure metabolic perspective, we obviously know that protein resynthesis is higher in that 30-60 minutes post resistance exercise, post eccentric muscle contraction. The inclusion of the high ketone BHBs in this is because some of the studies that Dan and I looked at, it's nothing to do with performance. Like, put it this way, the reason why we're using it is not performance driven. The reason we're using is that there's some really interesting studies that show that the body will, you can see the biomarkers of muscle cell degradation on leucine levels rising in the blood post, eccentric muscle contractions. That's classic in running, classic in cycling, etc. And when you add the ketones during the training session, you'll see there's a much more reduced level of that leucine level. And what the studies bring out is that the body preferentially oxidizes the ketones if it's there to be had, rather than oxidizing some of the muscle cell tissue during the session. So that's the purpose of the ketone inclusion in the formulation. And then the glutamine, like I said earlier, this is really a clinical dose, 5 grams. And there's just a ton of research on this, both in chronically ill patients, meaning like bed-bound cancer type patients. What you'll see is a very catabolic state where they're losing body weight, and you'll see that they're highly processing glutamine, very similar in the construct of endurance training, where you're essentially in a catabolic state. You are literally burning things up to support those types of training sessions. This sounds like a sales pitch, but we tell people, if it doesn't work, like, do your most intense classic HIIT training session that you typically get some type of delayed onset muscle soreness with. Do it, take note of what happens in the day and the second day after training session. Do it again with the Revival product. If it doesn't work, send it back, no problem. But we're pretty guaranteeing that this will work really well for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know I interviewed HVMN, their ketone IQ, and they're talking about the ketone IQ for post-workout recovery.
Yeah, well, we do a lot of, I mean, we developed this, of course, for the endurance athlete, but as we've got into the keto active lifestyle and non-athlete segment, the formulation, it's just getting adopted really well for, if you will, just because you're not doing physical exercise, some original reason we created SFuels wasn't actually thinking about the athlete. We were thinking about the corporate executive. And they just, if you look at what they burn through, the options they have to be healthy, stay in keto, it's really tough for them. So the Revival product's doing really well in that segment too.
So I'm gonna have to wrap up because I have my 25-year-long client I have after this. Can't be late for him, I'll get in trouble. But it's SFuels. You can find all this information and learn. And then the post-workout, I think, is great. I still didn't try that when I was at KetoCon. 3 hours to start. So you have all these guidelines, and I like the new products, keto cereal and endurance bar, and how to add that in, and the primed. And I think we'll talk more to Zach Bitter about how he uses these. And then we'll talk to Dan Pleuse about the Endure program and how to match your fueling and training. So, but for sure, you guys can find this information. I'll put the link in the show notes on the website, sfuelsgolonger.com, and you hit on learn, and you can get these great guides as well as the Endure IQ program.
Yeah, no, thanks, Debbie, for having us on. And if you wanted to go deeper in any of those sections, let us know.
Yeah, always. And I'm sure people have questions, but I think it's, how to become fat adapted and where nutritional ketosis fits in, and carb timing, strategic carb timing, and not all carbs are evil. Remember, it's real food sources of carbohydrates, nutrient dense, natural sources, or Mindy Pels always says nature's food.
Right.
So it's not in a box, except for SFuels. The drinks and stuff I think would be great, but it is hard fueling. I know I stopped racing competitively when I got my adrenal exhaustion in 2013, and nothing was really out there back then. And I was trying coconut nut butters and, doing nut packets and, trying to do different fuel sources. And it is hard. So it's great to have companies as yourself that you guys are doing the research and really formulating products that can help people train.
Yeah. Well, when Dave Scott joined the company, he was like, he talked about times past where they were taking like figs and rice cakes on the race and stuff like that. So there wasn't a lot of options available back then.
I didn't race that far away, but 2001 to 2012 was my Ironman years. And there wasn't that much, but that's how I got into this, because I would be trying to do what everyone was telling me back in the beginning, and I'd be throwing up the whole time. Like, okay, this year I'm going to try this formula. I'd be throwing up the bike ride the whole time. And then I got more information, I think it was Zone Diet. And then we started New Leaf Metabolic Testing Cart in 2005. And I'm like, how you train. And I did heart rate training when it started with Sally Edwards, who was part of the Heart Zone training history and created that. And
Barry Seals was driving a lot of it.
Zone Diet is where I started figuring out the nutrition. And then it started, coming together for myself and being curious, but it was so long ago and so few people as, Maffetone and everybody else out there. So it's great to see where we are today in our industry. All right. Thank you. Again. I'll be in touch, and we'll probably have you on again to go a little deeper into the science, because people like more of the science.
All right.